Now, for a system of notes that has only 12 possibilities, there's only 12 notes that we use in all of our music, you'll find that the concept of measuring their distances from one another, which is what intervals are, is actually terribly complex. And this is, of course, the foundation of everything else that we're going to talk about. And it's no wonder that understanding scales and chords is so baffling, because just understanding how to name the distances from one note to another is actually a very difficult thing to learn how to do correctly. When you're looking at the distance from one note to another, you are going to measure it primarily in terms of steps. Now, a step is either a whole step or it's a half step. So let's just talk about half steps first. That is sort of the fundamental unit of measurement in music, is the half step. Everything else is just an accumulation of half steps. On the guitar, this is very easy to understand, because a half step is just the distance from one note to the note either fret above or below it. So, for example, right here, where the tip of my pointer is, that's a C. A half step above it is the 4th fret. A half step below it is the 2nd fret. Pretty simple, right? Let's flip over to a keyboard and look at the same thing. So here's that same C. And now if I want to go a half step above it on the piano keyboard, usually that means going from a white key to a black key. But in some cases, there's 2 white keys right next to each other. So sometimes a half step away from a white key is another white key. But usually it's a white key to a black key, or a black key to a white key. If you jump across 2 half steps, well, then that's called a whole step. So usually going from one white key to another white key is a whole step, but not always, because there are these spots here that don't have any black key between them. Now, why do I bother showing you this on a piano keyboard? Well, I think that it's far more useful to think about your musical ideas in the framework of the piano keyboard, or in the framework of the 5-line staff for notation. And I say that at least compared to how easy it is to conceive of your musical ideas on the guitar, because the guitar is not a very clear interface for understanding what it is you're playing. It's a rather complex interface compared to the piano keyboard, which is a terribly simple interface. It's got no mystery to it whatsoever. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy to play the thing, but it's got no mysteries. Guitar, on the other hand, very mysterious instrument. And if you're trying to think about some of these theoretical concepts solely within the mental construct of the guitar fretboard, you're going to be very frustrated. And I think that's one of the reasons why guitar players in general spend so long not really understanding the musical foundations of what it is they're playing, because the instrument is just mysterious. So when we talk about these musical concepts in terms of the theory behind them, it's very important that we begin to connect those ideas not to the guitar fretboard, but to the piano keyboard and to the 5-line staff for written notation. Later, you can apply that back to the guitar. And you already know how to play the guitar somewhat, probably. So that connection is going to be easier if you begin to absorb some of these ideas in the context of the piano keyboard or the guitar, or the 5-line staff, and then mesh that later with what you know about the guitar. You're going to have to trust me on that. All right, so we talked about half steps, we talked about whole steps. Combining whole steps and half steps into larger intervals is what we're going to start to discuss a little bit here today. And as I said at the beginning, it's surprisingly complex to begin to properly name these things. And it's going to take a few minutes to even begin to present this to you. So be patient. You're not going to understand this all in one 15-minute video, but if the concepts are there, you can keep coming back to it. And as long as you stick with it and you don't give up trying to name notes and think about them in these relationships of intervals and then expanding that to scales and chords, it'll come to you. It's a long process and you do have to kind of exercise it like a muscle. One of the first things you need to know about intervals is that there are two classes of intervals. There's the class of intervals that occurs in a series, and there's a class that occurs in a simultaneity or all at once. You can think about these horizontally or vertically. So the names for those are melodic intervals or harmonic intervals. In other words, if I want to measure a note, to a note here, C to E, this is a melodic interval. This is happening in a sequence, in a series. So horizontally, in other words, the C is followed by an E, and I'm going to measure the distance between those two notes that are essentially a melody. So that's a melodic interval. This note happens, then that note happens. That's distinct from a harmonic interval, which is what we get when two notes occur simultaneously, or what you might think of as vertically. So melodies versus harmonies. Harmony suggests chord sound, but a harmony can be two notes, and two notes isn't a chord. So harmony doesn't necessarily always have to mean chord. It means simultaneous. Melody means in a series. All right, so that is pretty simple. The next thing I want to talk about is what's up with this key of C thing. As we talk about theory, we're going to come back to the key of C all the time. Now, as a guitar player, that might not have a lot of meaning to you because the guitar is not made any easier when you play it in C. This stems from the fact that on the piano keyboard, C is the simplest key because it doesn't use any black keys. There's no sharps and no flats in the key of C. If you're a guitar player, that's completely meaningless to the way you play the instrument because it's all the same on a guitar. If you want to play a scale in one place or another, you just slide it up and down. You don't have to deal with black keys. You don't necessarily even have to think about sharps and flats. So that may seem like a little bit of an adjustment at first, that we're going to talk about everything in C. You know, if you're a guitar player, you kind of think about everything maybe in the key of E or some, open string key, something like that. In the world of theory, you kind of start from C as home base all the time because everything is simpler to notate or watch on a piano keyboard if it's in the key of C. So that's why all our examples are going to start from the key of C. By no means does that mean that we're going to confine them to the key of C, because that would leave an awful lot of things out. So we're going to start with a note C here. And as I said before, the simplest thing you can do with an interval is go up a step. So if I want to go up a step from C, I get D. Let's just point that out on the piano keyboard. Here's a C. There's a D. You can see there's a half step in between them. That's the black key that we might call C sharp. If I want to go up another step from D, we get E. Again, there's a black key here in between D and E. If you're going to look at that on a guitar, it's really clear where those are. There's C, there's D, and there's E. This fret that was in between those two spots corresponded to the black key on the keyboard. Now, if I go from E to F, this changes. And there's two spots in every octave or cycle of these notes where this is true. It's always going to occur between E and F, that there is no additional half step, and then it will occur again between B and C. So if I want to write an F here, I have to type an 8 because there is no fret between E and F. This is going to come up again when we talk about scale theory, but it's important to point that out here too. Going back to my C, the distance from C to D was a whole step. The distance from D to E was a whole step because that had that black key in between. The distance from E to F is a half step. But they're all steps. And they're all the distance that we would describe in intervallic terms as a second. If a note is an interval of a second away from another note, that means that it is one letter name away. That's kind of the core of how we think about intervals. We think about them in terms of their distance in letter names. And if you think about why that is, as opposed to thinking about everything in a more raw mathematical sense in terms of the actual numbers of whole and half steps, it kind of makes sense because when you get up to 8, 9, 10 half steps, it becomes kind of cumbersome to think about them in their numerical distances like that. And it's actually far more musically relevant to talk about them in their distance in letter names. So the distance in letter names has everything to do with what line or space they're on. So you can see when I went from C to D, they're on a different line or space. The next space above this line for C is D, and the next line above that space is E, and so forth. So every time I change that, I'm changing the letter name, and this is how we're going to start measuring the distances. So I said, if you go from C to D, that's a second. From D to E is a second. If I skip a letter, for example, if I put a C here, and I put an E here, that's a third. If I skip a letter name, it's a third. If I skip 2 letter names, for example, if I change this E to an F, that's a fourth. So I have a C, I skipped D, I skipped E, and I went to F. F is the 4th letter above C, so that distance is a fourth. I really don't care how many half steps are in here. I care about the letter names. This is a fourth because it's the 4th note above C. If I change this to a G, you can probably guess that's a 5th. If I change it to an A, that's a 6th. If I change it to a B, that's a 7th. And you're probably going to guess if I change it to another C, well, that must be an 8th. Yeah, but we call that an octave. And you may have noticed in the past that the word octave contains oct, which means 8. Now you can measure intervals beyond that, and you'd be talking about ninths and tenths, 11ths, and so forth. But we're really primarily concerned with the distances inside one octave. All right, now this is just the beginning, really, because we have to have further qualifications for what happens when you land on one of the black keys in between these. And there's all kinds of other stuff that we need to talk about here. So let's go back to the clean slate here and talk about what you do when your notes fall in between. And we're going to go back to C. We're going to put an E here. Now, if we look at the piano keyboard, we can see that the distance from C to E is 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps. In other words, 2 steps. that distance we said was a third, but if we called this note, let's say this note wasn't E, it was E flat. So there it is as an E flat. Well, that's also a third, right? Because it's got a letter in between it. So we need some further clarification on how to name these, because they can't both have the same name. The distance from the 3rd fret to the 6th fret can't have the same name as the distance from the 3rd fret to the 7th fret. So this is where the major and minor designations come in. And it's also where things start to get complicated. The distance from C to E is 2 steps. And the distance from C to E flat is 1.5 steps. We're going to call C to E a major third, where we'll call C to E flat a minor third. Now, the first thing you need to know is that minor is always smaller than major. The difference between major and minor is usually the distance of 1/2 step smaller in the case of minor. So, why is one major and one minor? Well, if we're talking about a C major scale, and I know we haven't gotten there yet, and that's in the next video, but bear with me. If we're talking about a C major scale, if you were going to count up that scale from C to the next step, that would be D, and the next step would be E, and so on and so forth, all the way up all the white keys. We call E a major third above C because it's the note that occurs in the C scale. E flat does not occur in that scale, and it's smaller than the distance from C to E. So we're going to call E flat a minor third above C. E natural is a major third above C. Now that's going to work for all the notes in the C scale. So if I change this to a D, we said that distance is called a second when it's the next letter name away. And the distance from C to E, C to D rather, more specifically, is a major second because it occurs in the C major scale. So if I wanted to play a minor second above C rather than a major second, yes, this would be a smaller distance. C to D flat is a smaller distance than C to D, so that would be a minor second above C. Now, I know this is already probably a little bit confusing, and it's likely to get more confusing as we add the next couple concepts. But trust me, start thinking about it in these terms, and it will become clearer later. Let's cover the rest of the intervals here, just so this is very clear. All right, so we have C to D flat. That's a minor second. We have C to D. We said that's a major second. If we want a third, we're going to some kind of E. And if it's this white key E, we said that's a major third because it occurs in the C scale. If we lower that to E flat, we said it's a minor third. Okay, great. What happens if we go to F? There's F. C to F we know is a fourth. However, it gets further complicated because there's no such thing as a major fourth. For reasons that we're not going to get into in this discussion, fourths, fifths, and octaves are not referred to in terms of major or minor. They're called perfect intervals. So C to F is a perfect fourth. C to G is a perfect fifth. However, when we get back to A, the sixth, we're going to call that major minor again. So C to A is a major sixth. Now we could go back to describing this in terms of half steps, but you can see it's getting rather clumsy here to count half steps between C and A. There's C, A is all the way over there. I couldn't even tell you how many half steps this is off the top of my head. I would have to count them, and it's not important. What's important is the more musical designation here, that this is a major sixth, because that suggests a sound. Counting half steps doesn't really suggest a sound to anybody who's been doing this for any length of time. But if I say major sixth, I know exactly what a major sixth sounds like. And that's one of the things that we're going to start trying to really impress upon you as a student of music theory, is that sounds have names. You've already understood this in terms of, chord sounds. When you play a major chord, it sounds different from a minor chord. But in terms of just the raw relationship, the interval between one note and another, they have sounds that can be identified and given names. So we want to start thinking about those in terms of their intervallic naming systems. So when we go from C to A, that's a major sixth. Now a major sixth, whether it's from C to A or between any other two notes, has a sound to it that can be learned and identified. Just like all the other intervals have sounds to them that can be learned and identified. And that's something that we'll be covering in probably a series of ear training videos. It's rather difficult to learn this. It's a long process, but really essential to understanding musical ideas and how to make a sound that you hear, or name a sound that you hear, or be able to write it down, understand what it is. Now, if I lower this not to from C to A, but if I lower it to A flat, that's still a sixth, but now it's a minor sixth because it's a smaller interval. Let's just wrap this up with B. That would be a seventh from C to B. If I change this to B flat, that's a minor seventh. And then finally, we have the octave from C to C. That would be called a perfect octave. Now there's another aspect here that you may have already caught on to. When I was flipping these notes from sharps to flats, let's go back to an easier one. Let's say, let's go back to E. Now when I flipped that E to E flat, you can see the program here tried to call it a D sharp. And I said, no, give me E flat instead. And there's a really important reason why I did not want to look at D sharp there, because I was talking about thirds since I came from E, and I didn't want to see a D sharp there for a very important reason. And that is because if I change this to D sharp, it's not a minor third anymore. Now you might say, wait a minute, it's the exact same note. It's that note right there on a guitar. It's that note right there. It doesn't sound any different if I call it E flat or D sharp. So why do I have to give it a different name? And that is where it's really important to remember that we're trying to notate these things, and we're trying to think in terms of contexts that are keys and scales, whatever you want to call it. So it actually is enormously different to call this note D sharp or E flat. For the purposes of naming the interval, that change from E flat to D sharp means that this distance is no longer a third. Because the letter name changed, it's not a third anymore, it's a second. And we wouldn't be able to call that a minor third, even though the sound of this interval is identical, whether I call it E flat or D sharp. All right, so I'm sorry to end on that rather confusing note, but that's about all I want to say regarding intervals right now, because those are sort of the crucial points that are going to allow us to move on to the next idea of how to assemble scales from a series of intervals. You're probably going to have some questions about this, and I'll be happy to answer them in the comments if possible. So feel free to leave a comment if you thought that something wasn't clear. Bear in mind, this is anything but an exhaustive examination of interval theory. That would take a lot longer than a 25-minute video. So, you know, I'll try to point you towards other resources if you feel that's necessary, but I'm just trying to set us up to have a decent foundation to be able to talk about scale theory. I could have just jumped right into scale theory here without really talking about intervals, but it would have left an awful lot of gaps. So I hope we've covered enough here so that we can move on to the scale theory video and not leave too many people confused. So again, leave a comment if you want a further explanation on something here, and we'll try to help you out. Good luck. See you back for the next section. Thanks.